Alexander of Macedon by Harold Lamb. Chapter 12, Lady of the Beasts, is in part 2. Still, it was undeniably a new kind of earth lying before them. No one had beheld such a plain as this. No intelligence service could acquaint the marchers with what lay ahead of them. They had seen a few Asiatic horsemen along the Euphrates, and captives had informed them that the Asiatic army were gathering somewhere behind the next river. From the stories of the captives, the veterans judged that this new army would be larger than the masses they had met at Issus, and that had given them food for thought. They wondered how Alexandros could cope with still greater masses of horsemen on a plain such as this. They were not yet afraid, but they wondered. Instead of striking due east toward the second of the two rivers, Alexandros led them northeast, until the earth turned red again, and the flat-roofed villages changed to clusters of clay cones like beehives. He led them up to the mountains again, climbing into fir-clad foothills and gray rock ravines, before turning east again. Here the air was cooler, and water flowed swiftly down from the heights, and they could march with the comfortable feeling that no enemy was in these mountains above them. Some of the veterans who had gossiped with the surveyors guessed that these mountains led back to the Gordium plateau land, and they spoke of them as the Gorda mountains. Being on the shoulders of these mountains gave them confidence. When they crossed a rushing gray river at a long valley, they became more confident because the surveyors said this must be the headwater of the Tigris itself. And so the army had crossed the Tigris, the second of the two rivers, without being sighted by the Asiatic army. Yet, while they forded the Tigris, the moon had darkened in a total eclipse. That was surely a sign of a crisis approaching. Phoenicians among the engineers argued that the darkening of the moon foreshadowed the approach of the lady of the underworld, who was also called Astarte, who held great power over this land of the true rivers. The lady was served by the beast of the three worlds, the sky, the earth, and the underworld, so that she might appear mounted upon a dragon or a lion, or a great serpent. In any event, her advent would be ominous of evil. These Phoenicians, far from their seaport, became very much afraid. Having passed the Tigris safely, the columns united for a while, turning south along the river and then leaving it to follow an open valley where clouds and mist hid the heights around them. When they dropped down out of the cloud level, they encountered gray buffalo, which resembled oxen only in their passivity and strength. They might have been oxen transformed by Circe, or this lady of the beasts. When they sighted a dark gray plain far beneath them, the outermost scouts came in with tales of fresh wonders. The scouts had stumbled on giant stone beasts with wings and hooves, and the heads of kings. These winged monsters had been standing on either side of the gate of an empty city, where armed men and eunuchs also stood, lifeless, partially projecting from the tiled walls, all facing the same way, as if waiting. Also the scouts had seen a dry aqueduct raised upon a stone causeway, disappearing into the mountains. The next day, the columns passed the face of a cliff upon which the giant figures of kings or gods had been carved. The experienced Phoenicians made little of such rock carvings, only saying they were Assyrian kings and gods, a long time dead, so plainly without power to harm or to aid. When the scouts sighted the first force, a strange cavalry moving on the plain beneath, mountain regiments, stiffened by troops of companions and guards, were dispatched to bring back informants. They learned from the few captives they took that the army of the great king had assembled directly below them, where the foothills emerged into the open plain, and this army now had the corps of Persian guards, the spearmen called the Immortals, as well as new contingents of armored cavalry and horse archers from the inner reaches of Asia, Scythians and Bactrians. It had more horsemen than infantry. Alexandros was now faced by a greatly superior force of horsemen on open ground. For 3 days he camped in the lower foothills, resting the men and perhaps hoping that the Persian host would advance to attack him on the higher ground. Then he broke camp after dark and made a rapid night march down through the rolling grassland, coming over a ridge into full view of the enemy at sunup. The Macedonians in the ranks had expected to be deployed and led on into action in phalanx formation. That dawn, instead, they were halted. Once the battle line was formed and rested, the engineers fortified a camp enclosure behind them, and the officers spent the day riding out to study the ground and the enemy's formation, because no Macedonian had ever seen as many horsemen as were gathered there, near the village of Gaugamela, confronting them. The fear that had been in the minds of the Macedonians during the marches grew greater that day, and increased at evening, when torches and oil-fed fires blazed in a long line, cutting up the night in front of them, marking out unmistakably the vast extent of the army's masses. When the waning moon rose, marking shadows on the earth, and a night wind stirred the brush around them, it seemed to the watching men as if the hostile forces were in motion over the ground. The night touched them with horror. The officers felt this fear. They took measures against it. They had fortified the camp in the rear, but that would be a flimsy defense if the Macedonian formations were broken through. To guard against encirclement, staff officers divided the infantry phalanx, ordering the rear half to be prepared to face about. Fear touched the mind of Parmenio and the elder staff officers. They urged Alexandros to get the rank into motion and to make a night attack. Under the cover of darkness, infantry might move against cavalry, and the Macedonians might have a better chance against 4 to 5 times their number. Against this inhuman multitude waiting to destroy them, Alexandros would not order a night attack. He would not trust a movement in darkness, with torchlight in the eyes of his men. After observing that the Asiatics were standing armed in battle order with lights, he told the officers to rest the men where they were and to get what sleep they could. The conflict of the next day, he said, would be the last battle, because it would decide who would rule Asia, the Macedonians or the Persians, and he warned the officers to be careful to carry out orders quickly. It would be dangerous to delay. He felt the fear around him, like a tangible pressure, coming out of the darkness into the minds of his men, but he showed no signs of nervousness. When his officers kept on arguing and talking about the next day, he turned back into a small sleeping tent and lay down. He was still sleeping when those who could not sleep gathered around the tent in the chill before the first light. When Parmenio came up, Alexandros had not stirred. He had overslept. Parmenio ordered breakfast to be served in the ranks. When light touched the hills to the east, when he could see a veil of mist below the hills, he went in to wake Alexandros and had to call him twice by name. Alexandros got up and looked out and put on a light quilted jacket that had been captured at Issus, with a light helmet of thin polished iron. The black war horse, Bucephalus, had been led to the tent, but the men around him noticed that Alexandros mounted another horse, although he always rode Bucephalus in a close action. He seemed to be putting off the final moment of engagement, for which every preparation had been made during the spring and summer now past. The Macedonians were afraid, as men are always afraid when they move forward into the space between themselves and other men, in which they may be killed or broken or blinded. They go forward because an order has been given, because they have always done so, and because it is unthinkable to turn back alone when the others are moving forward, until the danger in front of them ceases to be there in that ever-narrowing space, or until it gains force, controlling their physical actions and driving back and away from the danger. Late in the morning, Alexandros was riding Bucephalus moving forward at a walk with the regiments of heavy cavalry, as he had been accustomed to do, and as the cavalry had been trained to do. There was no opening for them as yet in the insane confusion ahead of them. Twice messengers had come to Alexandros asking for support. The enemy had broken through and held the Macedonian camp behind him. The left of the army had been broken apart, and Parmenios sent a personal plea for support. The companion cavalry waited, moved on to a few places, waited. They waited while the units on their right were enveloped, twisted, and flung about. They could not do anything now but wait, while the advanced end of the Macedonian phalanx edged step by step deep into the masses of the enemy, and the Agrianians and the Thracian cavalry pushed forward to the other side of the wedge. Then there was a shifting of the masses in front of them. A body of Asiatic horsemen had swung out of position to circle out to the right. Into this opening between the forward edge of the phalanx and the struggling Thracians charged the heavy companion cavalry. It burst out of the tip of the wedge into the space vacated by the Asiatic horsemen. It angled past other units and struck at full gallop into the rear of the close-packed Persian guard. The immortals, so called, the thrust bit deep into the guard. Directly in front of them, the fear within the body of the great King Darius mounted beyond his control. Physically he was a coward, and he could not wait there in his chariot in the path of these oncoming horsemen. For the second time Darius ran away too soon from a battle. His chariot raced back out of the path of the companions, and the chariot horses ran away. His flight at first did not affect the greater part of the masses that obeyed him. It caused him a drifting that gradually became a pull exerted outward, drawing back the center of the army. That army had assembled upon the plain of Gaugamela because it obeyed the personal command of an emperor. Its parts had assembled from Babylon, from the Kurdish and Armenian mountains, and far Bactria, and Sogd, and Scythia, because an order had been given to the satraps, who themselves gave orders in the provinces, except for the Armenians and Kurds. These portions of a warlike host, met together for the first time, had come far from their own lands. No hatred or defiance of the strange Macedonians drove them into action near this village of Gaugamela. They had merely followed their own officers hither. But when the news that Darius himself had run away passed them from unit to unit until the army of the Persian Empire was held together by nothing, and it broke apart as different units followed their officers away from danger. This army had been defeated. It had ceased to exist. Alexandros, at the moment of the first breaking up, had the cavalry around the Parmenios' beaten troops, where he joined the fine Thessalian horse, still holding its own. By then the Persians were leaving the field and being mounted. They went quickly. The battle of Gaugamela, for a long time identified by the name Arbela, or Irbil, the citadel towards the mountains 60 miles away, was recorded in all its details by the Roman historian much later. They described it as an extraordinary example of how an inferior force, mainly of infantry, advanced to attack a far superior force, mainly of cavalry, upon an open plain and succeeded. They take notice of superior discipline of the Macedonians that held them together under stress, and the superiority in leadership of Alexandros when they opposed to Darius. But they make no mention of the fear that drove the Macedonians forward against the levies of the great king, which had much less to fear. For the Macedonians could not retreat from Gaugamela. They had to scatter to drive at a distance that much greater strength of the horsemen in order to survive themselves, whereas the Asiatic horse could retire with little harm. The Macedonians had no alternative but to break the opposing ranks terribly and completely. This controlling force of fear was added to the cohesive force of their discipline and training, and the driving impulse of Alexandros' personality. It was true of the Macedonians, as a Roman pointed out later concerning his own legions, that they were never so much to be feared as when they had most to fear. In the vast confusion of the plain that afternoon, the Macedonians gathered in rich and strange spoil, including armored elephants and scores of chariots equipped with scythe blades. 4 Roman armies at various times offered proof later of the hopelessness of fighting a losing action against Persian horsemen on the Syrian plain. Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony of Cleopatra notoriety, saved a portion of his command by retreating into the mountains. A Roman army was almost annihilated at Arha something. The printing's broken. Where the Trimovir Crassus was killed much closer to the coast of Gaugamela. Another was destroyed near Edessa, and its emperor Valerian taken captive. At least 2 cliff carvings by Persian artists still survive, showing Valerian kneeling before Shapur mounted. The 4th was led by the Emperor Julian as far as the Ctesiphon and suffered severely in long retreat up the Tigris, Julian dying on the way, and 1 wing of his command disappearing entirely. Xenophon's retreat with the famous 10,000 out of this valley north of the sea was accomplished without opposition from any unified command. The Greek mercenaries simply fought their way through and lived off the country, and they had a hard time doing it. At least they wept with joy when they beheld the sea again. Okay, their spoils included gilded spears of the immortals, the regiments of Dur mountain men who spoke a strange tongue, Armenian and skilled horsemen who wore loose trousers, flowing turbans, Kurds. These captives indicated that they came from the mountain wall to the east.